The Academy for Jewish Religion plays a critically important role in the American religious landscape, because not only do they train leaders for the Jewish community, they train leaders who embody and live into precisely the kind of pluralism which we need now more than perhaps any time in any of our lives.
AJR exposes its students to a variety of perspectives. This prepares them better to interact with the diverse Jews of their future communities. In addition, rabbis and cantors study with each other at AJR and learn the professional challenges of each other so that they interact as clergy in the synagogue in a much smoother way.
The value of AJR is so clear because in our very partisan time, having people come together to be trained as rabbis who come from different denominational backgrounds, different ideological perspectives, and to learn together is really the wave of the future.
Shalom, my name is Rabbi Rebecca Serbiu, and as the Director of Rabbis Without Borders at Kalal, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with many AJR students and rabbis, and I was incredibly impressed with their deep commitment to bring pluralism and spirituality and be willing to serve every aspect of the Jewish community.
Pioneers in offering pluralistic education and flexible part-time options for those called to these roles, AJR has been a shining light as we all strive to train inspired leaders who have the passion, learning, and commitment to meet the varied needs of the Jewish community.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar in our three-part series, Conversations about Climate Change and Judaism, presented by the Center for Judaism and Science of the Academy for Jewish Religion, a pluralistic Jewish seminary ordaining rabbis and cantors for North America and beyond, and Americans for Ben-Gurion University. Made possible by a grant from the Dialogue in Science, Ethics, and Religion program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. My name is Matthew Goldstone, and I am the Assistant Academic Dean at AJR. And this week, we will be discussing food production and our planet with Dr. Tamar Makov and Rabbi Ariane Weitzman. Our presenters will take a few minutes just to introduce themselves and perhaps speak a little bit about their interest in the topic, and then we'll engage in conversation. We hope to finish our conversation in about an hour, and because of the limited time, we may not be able to get to questions. But if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A field so our presenters can know more about what you're interested in and perhaps respond. So I'll ask our presenters now to just briefly introduce themselves and perhaps speak a little bit about their work and interest. So Dr. Makov, over to you.
Well, hi, thanks so much for inviting me. This is a really interesting type of conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So just a couple of words. My formal education is that I have a master's and a PhD from the Yale School of Forestry in a field called industrial ecology, which is basically a field that centers on quantifying the environmental impacts associated with pretty much everything. So if you want to know if it's better to use a plastic bottle or a reusable one, for example, or what is the carbon footprint of your next vacation, then this would be the field. And I have a bachelor's in clinical nutrition, which is why a lot of my work is actually centered around food systems and digitalization, and sometimes they even converge. So that's a little bit about me. And Ariane?
Yeah, so I'm Rabbi Ariane Weitzman. I'm a congregational rabbi in Montclair, New Jersey, and a graduate of AJR. And I am also a longtime vegan, and I think that is why my name cropped up when this was being planned. I have a background in science before I went into the rabbinate and was a high school science and math teacher for some time. And so I love to talk science, and I don't get to do it enough, and I'm really, really thrilled to be able to do this. I don't feel that religion and science are domains that don't get to talk to each other. In fact, we inform each other, and that is the truth through the entirety of human history. So, my interest in this topic is that I went vegan many, many years ago, and I did it at the time for ethical reasons because I chose not to use animal products or animals for food or entertainment in my daily life. But I didn't really have a belief that that choice would have an outsized impact on the lives of actual animals. You know, I understood I'm just one person, right? And I do just my thing. And I've continued to do just my thing as what feels to me like a moral baseline for my own life. But I have an interest in how those choices and how the accumulation of choices that we make across societies has a larger impact on our environment, on the lives of animals, on the lives of human beings, and what that means for humanity's future. And I'm also just a foodie. I like to eat, and I like to talk about food and what that looks like. And we'll be talking a little bit later on in this conversation, not just about what we choose to eat, but also when we choose not to eat things, when things are wasted, and what happens in that process. Over the past couple of years, I've been leading a charge to compost in our community, in our synagogue, and we've reduced our synagogue waste by over 50% as a result. So that's been a really, really exciting project, and it really fits right into what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about what needs to change, right? So what is the problem right now? How do human food habits affect the climate? How do our food choices affect climate change? And then we'll go from there. So Tamar, why don't we start talking off about, like, you know, what are we eating now? What are we eating? And is it a problem? Is what we're eating a problem?
So that's a great question, actually, because I think it really depends on who is we, right? Who are we defining as this collective we? And if we look throughout history, there's always been, you know, food is very important. Obviously, we kind of need it to survive, right? And so up until not very recently, food was actually pretty scarce, and most of the population on the planet was, you know, something between malnourished and severely malnourished, right? And hunger was really not a strange, you know, an uncommon phenomena. And even today, we know that in certain places around the globe, there is more food scarcity, right? But even if we talk about developed countries or rich countries, or if we want to call them, we can call it the global north, the West, right? Or US, Israel, Europe, and so on, the richer countries. Right now, we don't really have an issue that we are lacking food or we are lacking calories. However, we have kind of the other problem where perhaps we're not eating what we should eat to keep us healthy and thriving. And perhaps we're even eating a little bit too much, and also perhaps not the best things for us. So I would really say that there's kind of a dichotomy in terms of, are we eating what we should and do we have enough? And it really depends on where we are. So assuming that most people were able to log via Zoom and via their laptops, I would guess that most of us are not in the category of countries that are suffering from lack of supply of food, which brings us to the other issue, which is waste, right? So what are we eating right now? There's been a trend over time to increase caloric intake, increase the amount of processed foods, and also increase the amount of animal-based products. And when we talk about sustainability, animal-based products is really a hotspot because the environmental impacts of eating animal-based products are just so much higher. I mean, in industrial ecology, we look at things at the system level, which means that if I want to examine what are the environmental impacts of a steak, I would actually look at the full life cycle. So I would start with the seeds, who's making them, how are they made, then to the field, all the fertilizers, all the pesticides, all the gasoline that goes into the tractors that are harvesting and so on. The corn, okay, that then would be fed to a cow for, I don't know, sometime 2 years, probably something like that, maybe less. And then we would, slaughter this cow and then eat it. So in many cases, people are just saying, hey, we could just eat the corn, bypass the cow. And if we actually do that, the system itself would be able to feed a lot more people, right? Because not every single calorie that the cow eats is actually transformed into an edible calorie that we consume. The conversion, if I remember correctly, is under 5%, right? So under 5% of all the calories that a cow eats actually turn into calories that we as humans can eat, right? So it's really a very inefficient way to feed us, right? If we're thinking about resources. So I would say that that's a huge environmental issue. And just to put things into perspective, not all animal-based products are also the same. So red meat is really an outlier, and red meat is actually 10 times more environmentally harmful compared to chicken, for example. And of course, chicken is, not as good as lentils in terms of environmental impact.
So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about chicken in particular later, and chicken in the both Israeli and American Jewish experience. And it's so interesting that you talk about the transition from being human beings who struggled to get enough calories to our state today, which is that we have excess sometimes, that we have access to more than enough. And I wanted to say that, that is something that I really experience in Jewish community in particular, right? There is an attitude of we might not have enough. Make sure that there's so much food on the table that no one could possibly go hungry. Are you sure you're full? Do you want thirds? Do you want fourths? That is a very, I don't know if it's a worldwide, a global Jewish phenomenon, but it sure is a, Ashkenazi Jewish from New Jersey phenomenon. This idea that we not only need to have enough food, but we need to have the best kind of food, right? The most festive food at all times, right? So it's not just meat on Shabbat, it's multiple kinds of meat on Shabbat. It's fish and then chicken and then also red meat on Shabbat, right? Because it's a festive occasion, right? And that trickles into the rest of the week, right? It's not only on festive occasions. So that American Jews are certainly eating, like all Americans, are eating more meat than they ever were before. And I understand that that's true also in Israel, that there is more meat being consumed every day by Israelis than there were, 80 years ago. But kind of an outsized way. You were sharing with me some data about Israeli meat consumption. Maybe we can look at the graphs.
Sure, but maybe, yeah. So this is fascinating. So I came across these data the first time I was teaching a course, and we were looking at entrepreneurship and trying to think about, how could we encourage this food transition? And I wanted to look at some statistics about Israel and about meat consumption and meat and poultry. And I was shocked to find that, Israel actually ranks as number 2 globally. And this is updated data. So I first showed this for a couple of years back, and we thought that there might be some mishap with the statistics. And I literally called the Bureau of Statistics up on the phone to ask them whether the data was correct, because it really sounded insane that per capita, Israelis consume more meat, red meat. Well, this is actually supply, right? This is retail weight, but still, that Israel is higher than the US and is higher than Brazil, right? Or like Argentina is the only country in the OECD that is kind of in front of us in terms of meat per capita. And what I'm showing you here is the animal protein per capita by country, right? So this would be for the year 2023. And while meat were number 2, in poultry, we're actually number 1. And in some cases, yay, we're number 1, but I'm not sure that this is something that we should celebrate, because we really are an outlier in the amount of poultry that we consume. So I was thinking, okay, maybe this is only because we're trying to compensate for the fact that we don't consume pork. And actually, if we bring in, unkosher foods, then maybe this would kind of change the scale and, our leading position here. But maybe we could flip to the next slide, Matthew. So actually, even if you look at animal protein collectively, and I'm putting fish and seafood aside for a second, because most people, this is where like terrestrial animals is where most of the animal protein comes from, then Israel ranks fourth. So these are color coded. So red would be beef, poultry would be orange, sheep and pork, sheep would be white, and then pork would be pink. And as you can see, we really don't consume a lot of pork in Israel, but that doesn't affect our overall consumption because we compensate in the amount of meat and poultry, right? And I found this really fascinating because growing up in Israel, I don't remember a culture where every day you have to have meat, right? Like this wasn't really kind of the goal. So yes, on Friday dinner, and of course, on Passover, and like you said, festive occasions. But it wasn't kind of a daily routine, right? So I grew up in Dgania, among other places, and dinner was scrambled eggs and a salad, right? Or the Mediterranean diet. This is kind of what we have in our heads. And I found it really fascinating that not only are we leaders in the amount of animal proteins that we consume per capita, this has actually been increasing over time. So specifically, for Israel, I was able to pull data. So maybe we can flip also to the next one. So this is in Hebrew, so apologies to those who are not fluent, but what we can see on the right-hand side is 1950s, and the colors here again, we have red for meat, we have purple for eggs, blue is fish, and then the yellow is milk. And what I think we can see from the 1950s to 2020 is how much more dominant meat is in terms of protein supply per capita per day, right? So we really are shifting towards more and more and more meat, much less fish, but also in relative terms, also less eggs, which I found very surprising, both culturally and from a sustainability perspective. And just wondering, how did we get to glorifying or putting such an emphasis on animal proteins? It's not like there is no 4th of July culture, right? So it's not that entwined in, I don't know, the Israeli experience, at least not as I have experienced it. And I thought it was really fascinating what you had to say about, Judaism and the fact that this is, we want to celebrate it, we want to have a feast and so on, and trying to think of why that feast has to be meat-based in a way, right?
Right. This idea that feasting is meat-based is very ancient in Judaism. I would even say that it's beyond the meat. The idea that feasting has to do with more refined foods, right? Foods that are fattier, foods that are more processed also. So in the Talmud, they talk a lot about, is it barley bread or wheat bread, right? Is it a finer kind of bread or is it a coarser kind of bread? And the coarser kind of bread is for people who are less elite, people who are less wealthy, people who are less educated as well, right? This idea that education correlates to having finer food access. Also in the Talmud, there's and I don't remember exactly where right now, but there's we can all look it up later. There's this idea that people who are uneducated shouldn't eat meat, right? That meat is also a more refined food, and that we are always aspiring to be more educated, more wealthy, more elite in some way. In the American context, I think we're always aspiring, at least subconsciously, to be more white, right? To be more normal Americans. And there is an American culture of eating quite a lot of meat. So that all makes sense to me culturally as a practice. I would layer on top of that, at least in the United States, that there is a diet culture around consuming more meat, right? So there's a diet culture around, low carbohydrate diets, diets that are very meat heavy. I'm not sure if that translates across the ocean, but that is a practice that a lot of people are taking up. And it's interesting to me because it contrasts with another practice that is also, seems to me, on the rise, which is eating more plant-based, right? So people who are not necessarily vegetarians or vegans, but people who are choosing plant-based foods, whatever that means. It means a variety of things, and choosing products that have plant-based written on the label, right, for dietary reasons. So both of those dietary trends happening at the same time is really fascinating. And also in Israel, I was in Israel last year, and I was able to eat everywhere, right? And things are better and better in terms of eating vegan in Israel year after year. And so I know that Israel also has a very high proportion of vegans and vegetarians compared to many other industrialized nations. So it's fascinating that both of those things are happening at the same time, right? That there's a trend towards more meat eating and there's a trend toward more plant-based eating. They seem to be in conflict with each other and yet happening at the same time. And there is this layer in my own context of it's a really nice meal if it has meat, right? So I think about in synagogue, we have Kiddush every single Shabbat afternoon, and it's a nice lunch, and usually it's bagels and spreads of some kind of sort. And every so often somebody sponsors a Kiddush and there's meat. And it's a big deal, right? People come for Kiddush because it's meat. It's a big deal, as though they don't eat meat at home all the time. And no shame to them, because honestly, the folks who cook Kiddush on those days are great cooks. And they always also make a vegan option for me and many other vegans. But it's just interesting. It's like our impulse, right, is really interesting towards thinking that's a festivication, right? That is what's really joyful, is when we have a big hunk of meat on the table. So we talked a little bit about what the cultural lens is, right? What's happening on the ground. I'm curious about if we can get down into more nitty-gritty about why animal consumption could be problematic from an environmental landscape. So we talked about the waste of calories, right? So that we're losing calories as we go up, towards animals over plants.
Yeah.
Is there anything else to talk about in terms of emissions and other environmental impacts having to do with raising animals for food?
Of course. So again, it's this kind of inherent inefficiency where we invest a lot of resources and effort and energy into growing feed that then goes to feed livestock, which we then consume. And that's just not an efficient process in itself. And today, most of the agricultural land is actually dedicated to growing crops that go to animal feed. And since there's such high demand for animal feed, then, so basically they can eat they also need proteins, right? So they consume soy meal, for example. And if we think about growing soy, the idea that we need to produce more and more meat every year, right? So look at the Israeli population. So the Israeli population has been, we know that the Israeli population has been growing, right? Since the 1960s. We have, we're now at our exponential growth stage. So good luck to us, within 2 years or so with traffic. But even if we think about food, right? So it's not only that we are eating more meat, we're also more people. Okay, so in general, we need to produce more food also on a global level, right? Like global population is growing. We need to produce more food on a global level, and with the dietary shift, which is happening not only in Israel, but in the developed world as well, right? Because meat consumption, like you very clearly stated, is also something that could be related to income, right? So it correlates with income. Higher income levels and also urbanization tend to trigger this shift towards more meat consumption. And when we need to produce more meat for more people, we need more land, and we need more water, and we need all of these resources. And another reason why red meat in particular is more carbon intensive is not just because of its, inefficient conversion from feed to food, but also because cows fart, right? And this is methane, and methane is actually a very potent greenhouse gas. So its impact on climate change in the short term is much higher than the other types of greenhouse gases. So while we can be super efficient on the supply chain side, this is something that we simply cannot change, right? Because these are the bodily functions of the animals that we eat, so ruminant meat. And because of the super high carbon intensity of red meat, the industry in general, or many people, have been looking for solutions in this space. So assuming that people are going to continue to want to eat meat, how can we give them this meat but at lower environmental impact, right? So how can we increase the eco-efficiency of this basic food commodity, or what is considered basic for many? And indeed, in recent years, like you mentioned, Ariane, we have a lot of these alternative protein options. So we can call them meat analogs as well, right? So this could be your Beyond Burger or all of these, but also now there's really a booming industry in Israel, which I find fascinating, which is a cultured meat. So we can call it, lab-based meat, for example. So these would be cells, for example, of a cow that are cultured in a lab, and they are the real thing, right? They are real cow cells. It's exactly the same as the animal, but we don't need to feed it as much, and we can also grow exactly the specific things that we want to grow. So we don't need to grow, I would say, eyes or ears or even leather, right? We can just grow the steak that we want. And many people are talking about this as the future revolution of producing real meat for people and getting to a place where these analogs can really compete in terms of taste, quality, and nutritional composition. So, Judaism actually has a really interesting twist on that. I think maybe you can speak more to that than I can.
When we were talking about this in planning this conversation, we were talking about cultured meat and whether cultured meat could be considered kosher. And the questions around kosher slaughter, right, is one question, right? Can you eat a meat product that has not been slaughtered properly because it's not actually an animal? And then whether or not this food, if it's considered kosher, is it parv, right, or is it basar? Is it meat? Is it a neutral thing that you could eat with cheese or with anything else? Or is it actually meat? And that question is both a kashrut question, right? And it's also a marketing question, right? So how do we market a food like this to people who really want to eat meat, right? We want to call it meat. And as soon as you do that, it's also complex, right? If it's meat, then there's all these other questions around kashrut that have to be part of the mix. And there are some who argue that it is not meat because it is the culture, the cell that is used originally as a culture is so small compared to the final product. There's this concept of batel b'shishim, right? When there's 1/60th or less of the final product is this accidental trace ingredient or the accidental meat ingredient, that it doesn't infect the entire product. And there's, folks who are experts in kashrut might have a longer conversation about whether when we are putting this cultured cell in there on purpose, right, whether it can be nullified or not, which is a different story than batel b'shishim traditionally. This is a longer question, right? But it is a question. And I was asked several months ago about Impossible Foods. They came out with this Impossible pork, right? And should it get a hechsher? Right? And the OU, the Orthodox Union, which is the primary giver of a hechsher in the United States, did not want to give it a hechsher because, it's too much like pork, right? It will lead people to eat something that they might think is pork or that someone else might think is pork, that you're looking at it. It will train us to eat pork, right? But the same product that is labeled Impossible Beef does have a hechsher. And, it's like a question. Right? Because if we're just talking about Jews, and there's not that many of us, should the market revolve around our conversation about this? And if it's labeled as not meat, that helps us out in some ways. And it also detracts from Jews using these products in some ways. So that's like a whole long question. And when we're talking about alternative protein sources, we have to talk about soy foods, right, and gluten foods, things like Impossible Beef, things like Beyond Beef, right? All of these products, which taste very good, I think. And I don't actually, as people ask, like, does it taste the same? I'm like, I have no idea if it tastes the same, but it tastes really good for what it is. And it brings up the question, as you alluded to in your introduction, is the reusable bottle or the plastic one-use bottle better or worse, right? Is it really better to use a soy food, right, versus a meat product, when we also know about agricultural monocultures, right? The problems of growing huge fields of soy or corn or wheat and the problems around that. I have a take on this, but I'm curious if you have a response to that question.
So I think there are two things that are important to remember when we think about the question of what's like, is it better? So I would say that the classic industrial ecology answer is always, it depends. And I'm sorry, it depends, because it's a bit more complicated than that. So the reusable bottle is only more environmental if you reuse it a lot, right? So if you're like me and you happen to lose these every time you go on a train, which is at least once a week for me, the reusable bottle is not your option, because it does take a lot more materials and energy to produce it compared to the single use. But this is only if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, right? So it's also really important to think about what type of matrix we are considering. So if you're talking about monoculture, the same monoculture soy used to produce whichever burger is the same one that's used to produce the feed or the soy meal that gets fed to the cows and so on. So that's not really a difference. And in terms of environmental impacts, there's actually, there are pros and cons for large-scale industrialized systems. Large-scale industrialized systems are the reason that we have been able to feed all the billions of people that are now living on this planet. So I think that right now we're all kind of ready to shove the industrialized food system down the drain, but maybe we shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater, or if I'm using this expression correctly, right? Like, there are some very good things that we have been able to achieve through industrialization and through these monocultures. These monocultures have been very effective at putting more calories on our tables and getting us out of food scarcity. Now, what we can think about is, okay, given all the technology that we have right now, and given that now we are more aware of the damages, right, of fertilization and of land use change and so on, what do we want the future food system to look like, and how are we planning it right now? And I completely agree that perhaps looking at the global food system from the prism of Judaism might not be a good exercise, because ultimately everything can be kosher, but there's only a limited number of people who care about kosher. So if we're thinking big, large scale and future, right, then all these other alternatives are perhaps better. But again, even if we talk about the cultured meat, so yes, I can definitely say that my research suggests, and this would be my own numbers, so I tend to believe them, working with companies in this field, yes, they are better in terms of carbon, and they are better in terms of land use and water and so on. So these would be both the alternative proteins that are plant-based and also the emerging industry of cultured foods. They're probably going to be better. However, they're only better if they are actually reducing meat consumption. Because if we start to consume Beyond Burger instead of hummus, or instead of just eating lentils, then that's probably not a good idea. Because the pure, simple vegetarian option is typically more environmentally benign than the meat analogs, right? So it really is a question of who will be consuming these alternative proteins, and would it be vegetarians like me that scarcely eat meat, or you, right? That you would, this is not, the fact that you're eating an Impossible Burger doesn't mean that somewhere the production of a regular burger is being avoided. So I think that that's something really important to remember. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's really absolutely true. I remember when Impossible Meats came out, and there were widespread conversations in the vegan community around whether Impossible Meat was vegan, and it had to do with the use of a GMO product that's in the food that had to be tested on animals before it could be approved for human
Okay.
use, right? So that was the question because it involves animal testing. Is this final product vegan? Um, and I tend to not be vegan for personal purity reasons, right? And so I can let that slide. I can I can live with that reality.
Yeah.
But the bigger question is like, this wasn't made for us, right? Impossible Meat was not made for vegans. Vegans
Right.
enjoy it, some of us, right? Or Beyond Burgers, right? Enjoy it. Some of us enjoy those things, but they weren't made for us, right? They were made with a goal of marketing to people who want to eat meat, right? And so the environmental benefit of that is if that person doesn't eat a burger made from a cow and instead eats an Impossible Burger, that's a win, right? But it doesn't matter if any vegans eat it. That doesn't matter, right? We can keep eating lentils and chickpeas. I'm going to keep eating lentils and chickpeas also, and primarily, right?
Yeah.
But it's nice to go out to a restaurant sometimes and have a burger and fries. So it's really important to know who the market is, and
Right.
the question of industrialization and the fact that we live in a system that is this food system that is fully industrialized, that has benefited us in amazing ways, will continue to benefit us. We have a kind of nostalgia that seeps into our thinking about food. Like, if this is more like what my grandmother ate, it's better, right? And that is false in a variety of ways, right? But also it's unattainable, right? So there's a lot of folks would like to replace their kosher meat, for example, with organic local kosher meat, and those markets exist, but they are so small and so expensive that most people can't actually access them, right? It will never replace this industrialized meat culture or the industrialized food culture, because that's how most people are getting fed. There just wouldn't be enough to go around in terms of land use, unless people ate very.
Well, I mean,
doesn't mean to be.
I hope
Yeah.
that, sorry, like I hope that
Yeah.
perhaps we can find ways to make organic more efficient as well, right? So I'm not sure it will never be able to feed us. Let's hope it might, and there could be other improvements, right?
Yeah, I don't mean that organic can't feed us. I mean that, like, this
Okay.
idea, I'm gonna buy a cow from, the neighborhood that's kosher, organic, local, like that branding. And that's going to solve my problems. It only solves your problems if you're eating a lot less meat. And that's not, and if you have a lot of money to put up front, to buy that cow, right? So it's a nostalgic response to a problem that is not going to be solved by nostalgia. But if we had nostalgia for, like, our ancestors who ate a lot of lentils and chickpeas, that would be great. A simpler lifestyle. That would be amazing.
Something else where nostalgia might really be useful. For example, like the whole waste not, want not. I totally bring that back, right? Like, we are very wasteful in terms of food, and like the amounts we throw away are just staggering.
Yeah, all right, so let's talk about waste. Waste is our other big topic, around how food is environmentally, can be environmentally damaging, our food choices. So what is the scale of food waste that we're dealing with?
Huge. It's depressing to say, but globally, we waste about 1/3, so 33 to 40% of all food produced for human consumption is wasted, period. So think about 3 plates on the table. One of them, open the trash can, throw it in. Those are the global statistics. And in industrialized societies or richer countries, this is mostly at the retail and consumer levels, right? So it's not necessarily losses in the field, which can occur because of, there's a drought, there's a cold spell, right? And then all the crops are destroyed. But this is really an issue where we live, right? Where people eat too much and too much meat. Then it's really at the retail and consumer level.
Yeah, that's shocking. That's really shocking. In my community, there are a variety of ways that people try to reduce food waste, but they're hyper local, right? So we are neighbors with a soup kitchen, and so if we have a big meal at the synagogue, we bring over huge amounts of leftovers to them, and they feed people in the neighborhood who are food insecure. And in my own community, there is a Buy Nothing group on Facebook. Perhaps people have one of those in their communities. And people will take opened containers of food, things that are, approaching or just past an expiration date, right? So that food gets shared. But that's a lot of labor on the individual in terms of food waste. I try not to buy more than I'm actually going to eat, so that we don't have that problem. But it feels like those kinds of efforts are useful, but maybe not solving the problem at its root.
So there are a couple of issues with food waste. So if we think about greenhouse gas, for example, so we also have greenhouse gas when we throw the food into the landfill, which is usually what happens because it disintegrates and methane goes up again. And actually, I had a colleague at Yale, my office mate, was doing his PhD on the Paris Agreement. And he actually found that no country is going to be able to meet Paris Agreement goals because no one took into account methane emissions from landfills. And this goes back to the organic content that we throw in landfill and foods specifically. So that's one place where our food waste basically adds environmental burdens. But also, again, if we think about the inefficiency of producing a steak so I can eat it, now instead of me eating it, right, I throw it in the trash can. So this is even a greater wastefulness. These are wastefulness levels that are so high that it really is just, mind-blowing and shocking. And I think that what your community is doing is actually amazing because we know that, we were talking about how we are in these cultures of abundance, but actually there's a very, well, not a very high, but food insecurity is still a prevailing and pressing issue, even in the richest economies in the world. So US, UK, Israel, food insecurity is a real thing. And we can check how many households, like the most updated statistics, but this is something that really, was brought up, came up in the news perhaps around COVID, right? When we had all these supply chain disruptions and suddenly people literally kind of didn't have enough food. So these are not the same images of hungry people in Africa, right? But these are images of people who are not eating a well-balanced diet, right? So they're not getting everything they need. So they might want to not be thin and skinny, but they are lacking on critical nutrients and so on. So I think that actually one of the best things that we could do with food waste is actually valorize it and turn it into not waste anymore, but recapture it as food. But the question is really about reduction in source, right? So how do I not buy that extra steak, or how do I not buy that, every week we have a farmer's market once a week, and every week I buy basil and lettuce, and every week at least one lettuce head dies in my fridge because I want to buy it fresh from the farmer's market, right? But then by Friday, by the next, and my refrigerator maybe is bad. And so all I'm saying is that there are all of these issues, and every time I throw it in the trash can, it really, it bothers me. But it really is also how I consume, what I consume, and what I buy. And I think that there are many, many options of reducing food waste at source, but there are also cool things like what you said. And then I was also working with another platform that basically did peer-to-peer sharing of food leftovers, which I thought is great. And this is actually a platform that has over 9 million users worldwide. So if you're asking, they're active in the US, they're called Olio, and they're really good. And I know that there are all these local community efforts as well. But I would say that giving takeover after Shabbat dinner and having your guests take some of the food home is probably a nice thing, but also the most environmental thing you can do. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious just to put like a little pin in composting, in how effective you think that is in reducing the greenhouse gases and the effects of food waste. And in particular, if you see municipal composting as a way forward, right? So not just composting at my own home, but composting on a town level, a city level, if that is a way forward.
So composting is definitely something that we're going to have to do. So I think, like it's death by a thousand paper cuts. We're going to have to do all of the above. We're going to have to need new technologies, novel foods, composting, change our diets, all of the above. Actually, the most efficient thing we can do in terms of environmental impacts with our diets is go on a diet. So consume less calories is actually like the most efficient way, and study after study shows that as well. So I don't know if you're feeling bad about taking Ozempic, maybe there's an upside to that, just saying. But composting, I think, has a very central role in dealing with the waste that we already have, right? So instead of it going to landfill, perhaps we could still utilize it in a way that can enrich our soil. And then perhaps we could also avoid buying fertilizers, right? Or ruining the Dead Sea because we are in need of all these fertilizers worldwide. So I think that composting is great. I think that there's still an issue in terms of, so the industrialized facilities have all these issues with the purity of the compost stream. So we did this fun project at Yale where we actually got to dig into the waste that was separated from compost, because the composting facility that Yale used to send its waste to gave them like I don't know how to say it in English. They're like anyway, they scolded us that that they are getting all these metals inside the waste stream, and that's actually ruining their machinery. And what we did this audit, and we indeed found that students, along with their food waste, here and there a fork went in, plates, butcher knives. One of the chefs had forgotten one of those inside, plastic cups, all these types of things. So I would say that there's actually an issue of wishful recycling. Someone has called it that, where we put something in the recycling bin, even though we kind of know that the styrofoam isn't going to be recycled. We still kind of put it in hopes that, or something like that. So I think that when we talk about composting, definitely a solution that we need to upscale. Many people are actually looking at mobile stations that they could put in, residential areas. But we also need to think about the purity of the stream, and also what do you actually do with the compost that you guys from the synagogue? Like, do you have enough land that you apply it on, or?
So we send all of our compost to an industrial composter that does residential collection for the most part, and then they return to us bags of compost, every season or so. We do have some land that we put it on, and we also send it home with congregants to their home gardens. So I have a home garden, and I put it on my home garden, and it does very well. And we have a rule inside the synagogue that, when in doubt, throw it out, meaning there are so many things that people think should go in the compost that don't go in the compost, like tea bags, for example. When in doubt, throw it out. Don't put it in the compost. Don't put it in the recycling if it's problematic. And we are constantly auditing our compost, right? We will go through the bins.
Wow.
We will go through the recycling bin, right? We have constant education. It requires quite a lot of education for people to know how to compost properly, and we're trying our best. But it's remarkable how much waste has been reduced. And it's also just, it's a visualization of how much food people are throwing away, how much of everything else people are throwing away, right? And that by itself feels educational. So I see that we are moving toward the end of our time. I want to just say there's some questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to, and that's okay. If people ever want to reach out to me and ask me questions by email, please feel free to do that. But I did want to respond to two questions that came in. one from Baruch who asked, besides the composting project, how does my vegan lifestyle influence my rabbinic practice? So I want to share a little bit of a teaching. This is from the Ramban on the phrase "Kedoshim tihu," you shall be holy. And there's this disagreement between, I think it's Rashi and Ramban, like, is Kedoshim tihu, you shall be holy, a header for a section that's going to have a bunch of mitzvot, a bunch of commandments that constitute the practice of being holy, right? Is it just the header for the whole parsha? Or is it a separate commandment, right? Is it a commandment by itself, you shall be holy? And then what does that mean? If it's a commandment, you shall be holy, what does that mean? So the Ramban says, you can do all kinds of things that are not against Jewish law that still make you not a great person, right? You can be a bore, you can be a glutton, you can be, foolish in all different kinds of ways and still be following Jewish law, right? So Kedoshim tihu exists, you shall be holy, exists as a commandment to remind you, how can I be holy in this moment, in this choice, in a way that Torah may not have been able to cover, right? You can't say every single thing. And you have to use some common sense. So for me, being vegan is my way of behaving in a way that is like, what is an easy step for me to take to act in the best possible way around this particular issue? There are other issues where it's harder for me to take a good step to act in a more holy way. And for other people, it's very easy, right? So we all have our own place where we could be doing better and figure out how can I be holier in this moment. And I would say for all of my rabbinic practice, I try to bring that commandment and that teaching to bear on all of my practice, right? So when it comes to how do I teach in a room, how do I preach, how do I deal with congregants' issues, how do I deal with issues in my community, I try to bring that teaching. But I also would advise people, I don't like to preach veganism to my own congregants because it feels very pushy. But I say, what could you do, right? Could you eat less meat on Shabbat, right? Could you, have a meatless Monday? Could you, eat some lentils, right? What could you do? And people can figure out for themselves, what can I do? Understanding that each of our practices by ourselves, right, is not going to answer the whole problem. But what we could be doing is we could try to be doing our own best, right? We could be taking it seriously. And that's all we actually as individuals can do. For some of us, it's very easy to not eat meat. It's not a big deal. I've been doing it for a long time. It's no big deal. And for others, I understand it's not so easy. So we have to figure out what is our next best action. Tamara, do you have any last words?
Just that I love that what you just said, and that's absolutely true. And every little thing we do can and will have an impact. And let's not just think that since we're only individuals, we have no agency. We do. And I would actually advocate that, if you have events, they don't always have to be meat-based. You could have, a very special kiddush where everyone brings vegan stuff just one time, because it's also about trickling social norms, right? And if you make, I bet you cook really, I want to taste your vegan cooking now, right? So if
You're
it's something
invited.
that's super delicious, then I think that can also introduce people to things that perhaps they weren't accustomed to, but they might be willing to be open to now that they know that, hey, it's actually really good. So thanks a lot. It was
there's
really
a
interesting conversation.
A Jewish vegan chef named Isa Chandra Moskowitz, I think is her name, and she calls this cupcake activism.
Yep.
Just feed people good food. So I just, I'm so grateful that we had this conversation, and Matthew asked us for a sentence or two about hope for the future. I have a lot of hope in the ingenuity of human beings and in the fact that we have been endowed with a lot of wisdom, and that includes the wisdom to see problems as they truly are and to think creatively about their solutions. And we can think our way out of lots of things if we try hard.
Well, I agree. I think that's a perfect ending, and fingers crossed that you're right.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our presenters and to everyone for joining us today. We really hope that you've enjoyed our webinar series, and we hope that you'll join us in the spring when we hope to continue with our annual webinar on Judaism and Science, presented by the Center for Judaism and Science of the Academy for Jewish Religion and Americans for Ben-Gurion University. We plan to send out the recordings from our 3 webinar sessions to everyone who registered in case you missed a session or you want to watch one again. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you to everyone. Thank you so much to our presenters. This was fabulous. And have a wonderful week, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.